Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Two Sons Podcast. I am your co-host, Philip, and in today's episode, it is going to be just me again, unfortunately. For those of you that are unaware or just don't know what's going on, um, my brother is currently in that stage of school where he just has a lot of assignments and projects that are all built up into 1 week. And so unfortunately, he's been bombarded with schoolwork and everything, and he's still in the process of moving and settling down and everything. So he was unavailable to join me last night in a recording of Two Sons podcast, like we usually do. For those of you that watched and listened to last week's episode, that was also another episode that was put out by myself. Um, before I get into the rest of the recording, I just want to thank you for all the love and support on that video. It did extremely well. A lot of people seem to really enjoy the conversation about the High Republic. A lot of people seemed to take interest into what I was saying, um, which gives me ideas, for future episodes as I dive into the High Republic books myself. I would like to do, some book reviews, maybe just go over, what the plot was about and how I, ultimately enjoyed the book. So I mean, those episodes might probably run about 20 to 25 minutes, but I do plan to kind of make a little mini series based on the High Republic, as I am currently reading one novel called Midnight Horizon. And the other day, I just got in from Amazon the first book of the third phase, called Trials of the Jedi. And the book is by George Mann and is called The Eye of Darkness. So I plan on finishing Midnight Horizon first before I dive into that book. Um, but just be on the lookout for episodes like that in the future if you guys want to see something like that. Um, in today's episode, I decided to kind of take a step back. We've been talking about Star Wars a lot recently, and the episode that we were actually going to do last night, we were actually going to talk about some Marvel news. Because there's been a couple of things that have came out. Obviously, Loki season 2 wrapped up last week. The Marvels just aired that weekend as well. So, there's been a couple of Marvel projects that have finished up and came out. You also have What If season 2, I believe, airing on the 20th or the 22nd of December, followed by the trailer for Echo that released, that is coming out, I believe, next year. And then you also have the most recent trailer of Madam Web that also came out, that I believe is scheduled to release next year as well. So a lot of stuff going on. Excuse me. A lot of stuff going on. Um, so we hope that you guys will join us next week, if possible, because it is Thanksgiving and it is going to be Black Friday weekend. So we'll see if we're able to get together with one another. But if not, you might see an episode happen earlier in the week, or if not, then unfortunately there might not be an episode next week because of the holiday. So just please keep that in mind. But because we were going to be talking about Marvel news and anything related to that topic, my brother has unfortunately not watched the latest season of Loki, but I have. So I thought I would kind of sit here and just, basically have a casual conversation about what my reviews and what my thoughts were about Loki season 2, and what I enjoyed about it, how I thought it was, and then basically just wrap up the episode after that. So this is going to be another short one, probably around like, 20, 25 minutes, kind of similar to the last episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy these little shorter ones. We always just want to put content out for you guys, regardless of if we're together or if it's by ourselves. So again, thank you for all the understanding and all the patience. We will update you and let you know when we are going to be back together for an episode, the two of us. But for now, I hope you guys enjoy my little conversation about Loki season 2. I would love to hear your comments and thoughts in the sections below, whether you're listening to this on Spotify or any of the other podcasting platforms, or you're watching this on YouTube. I would love to see what you guys thought. The general consensus around the board, from what it seems like from Marvel fans, is that they absolutely loved it. And that is my consensus as well. I mean, there are a few people that, might have been a little confused or, maybe didn't enjoy it as much. But overall, it seems like it was a great project for Marvel, especially in their Phase 5 era. And, there's definitely a lot to talk about with the show. So, like every episode, before we really dive into, the content and the bread and butter, we'll talk about how we're doing. So obviously, like I said, my brother is, very busy with, schoolwork and projects, and anybody that's in college or especially in graduate school, you know how that is. So just send him some love and prayers as he gets through, some of his assignments. Um, and there might be some good news to look forward to on the horizon. It looks like he might be moving into his very own apartment soon. So that should be really cool, really exciting. So best of luck, obviously, with that. But obviously, we'll keep you up to date on anything that happens because of that. Me personally, I'm doing pretty good. Today I'm a little tired. I had to drop off my grandfather for surgery. As he was scheduled for some back surgery this morning. So my thoughts or prayers are with him as well. And I'm sure that the Two Sons podcast fan base, is also sending their love and prayers, which we always appreciate. But hopefully I have the day off today, to just relax and give you guys an episode and satisfy you guys for the week. But other than that, I mean, school's going really well. Work is going really well. And overall, I'm in pretty good spirits. So besides being tired, but you know what? I have something that could fix that. Excuse me while I take a sip of my lovely Dunkin' Donuts drink. Now that it is the holiday season, we are starting to move away from pumpkin spice and we're starting to get some of the classic flavors back for the winter, such as peppermint mocha and toasted white chocolate, which I am currently drinking because it is absolutely delicious. Um, So if you were feeling festive and you were in that mood, please head to Dunkin' Donuts because they got a variety of selections to choose from, and overall they are very, very delicious. Not sponsored, by the way, but just just a little bit of a callback to when, I used to do that when we had Dunkin' on the show. So yeah, little Easter egg for you Two Sons podcast viewers that have been with us for a while. But no, like I said, doing well. Everybody's, overall doing pretty well. So, just really looking forward to getting to this episode, to be honest. So, as you guys know, Marvel Phase 5 basically kicked off at the beginning of the year. So we started with the Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumanium, and obviously that had some mixed reviews. Overall, it was definitely pretty low on the scale. I think, when it came to like net worth and then also like what it was reviewed and ranked at, it was definitely one of the lower Marvel projects. I think, critically, audience score and then even how much it made in the theaters, I think they were all pretty low from Marvel movies. So unfortunately, even though I enjoyed it personally, I probably would have gave it like maybe a 6 or 7 out of 10, because there were things that, could have been different or could have went in a different direction. But overall, it was a pretty okay film. I mean, for the start of a new phase, I mean, I really was hoping to get off to like, that jumping point and really, really entice the audience. But unfortunately, it kind of fell through when it came to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Then obviously we had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 release, and obviously that is really what kicked off Phase 5, in my opinion. I mean, obviously, even though we started with Ant-Man, um, Guardians of the Galaxy really kicked off Phase 5. I mean, so many people were looking forward to it. It got massively positive reviews. Everybody loved it. They laughed, they cried. Overall, I mean, myself personally, I'd probably give it like a solid 9 out of 10. I mean, I think it's probably the best or at least the second best Guardians movie, whether or not you put the first one before this one. Um, it was a great movie, and I think it did really well in the box office. It's probably up there for top 10 movies of the year. And it was a really great conclusion to the Guardians of the Galaxy story. And it's not going to be the last that we see of Star Lord or Peter Quill. So we'll see what appearances he makes in the future. But as for the rest of the Guardians, we don't know if we're ever going to see him again. Except if they're in like a What If series or maybe some sort of side project. But then we kind of saw Phase 5 start to grow a little bit. And then we got the Secret Invasions, right? And say what you want about Secret Invasions. I personally enjoyed it. For me, it's probably in my top five when it comes to Marvel shows, to be honest. I know everybody likes to dog on it, especially, in the very final episode, because there is just one CGI battle that is just terrible, to be honest. I mean, the fact that we cannot get good CGI battles these days, and it's 2023, and we were kicking ass and doing really good CGI, in the early 2000s, I mean, boggles my mind. Um, so, whether they want to cut costs or they just got lazy and they, didn't want to put the money or the effort into it. Overall, I'd probably give that show maybe like a solid 7.5 or 8 out of 10. Of course, there were things that, could have been done a little bit differently, but I think overall, I think it was a really good show. I really like what they did with the scrolls. in the whole Secret Invasions. I mean, obviously, it's probably much different than from what it is in the original Marvel comics. But I personally love the Skrulls. They're probably like my favorite alien race in Marvel, or in the MCU specifically. And I would love to really learn more about Secret Invasions and everything. I mean, I think that's a really cool point in the MCU, and I'm sure it is in the Marvel comics as well. But again, similar to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium, some people hated it. They really didn't like the show. Some people loved it. So, you kind of had like a 50-50, with the audience and the fandom during that project. So we saw kind of phase five, start about here, and then like it kind of plateaued, it kind of stayed the same. Then Guardians brought it up, and then Secret Invasions might have brought it down again. But then that leads us into, I think, if I'm not missing any projects, that should lead us right into Loki season two, and which is what we're supposed to be discussing this episode. But I just wanted to kind of get like the roller coaster of phase five projects that we've seen this year, out of the way before we talked about Loki. As I mentioned, when Loki season two wrapped up, the Marvels, which is the final movie for this year for phase five, came out that weekend. And surprisingly, even though the critical score or the critic score is lower, I think it's only about like 60%. The audience score is about an 85% last time I checked. I mean, it's been a while since I checked, but it did have one of the worst box office releases for a Marvel movie. I believe it only made like $40 million. So right there with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium, probably even a little bit lower. So you'll see statistic wise that it's lower with Marvel movies for the box office release and then also the critic score. But the audience score seemed to love it. A lot of people seem to love the three actresses together. They say it's very funny. I haven't seen it yet. I'm just gonna wait for it to come out on Disney Plus because me personally, I'm not gonna spend my money on it. That's what I pay for Disney Plus for. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to watching it. But it seems like the Marvels might have kind of, maybe jumped off the success of Loki season two, and I think it left phase five in a good place, for the end of the year, then moving on into 2024. But we're here to obviously talk about Loki season two. And I mean, for those of you that do not know, um, um, we never discussed Loki on this channel or on this podcast, unfortunately. We've both seen the first season, but my brother has not seen the second season, so that's why I'm talking about it. But I would like to do like a overall review of the show after he watches the second season, because I would really love to hear what he thinks about it. And that should be a pretty interesting conversation. So hopefully we'll get that done in the future. But like I said, today we are here to talk about Loki season two. Right off the bat, I mean, honestly, if I had to give it my own personal rating of what I thought of the show, this is a solid 10 out of 10 show. I mean, Loki season one was magnificent. And I feel like season two just built off that momentum, obviously. I think Tom Hiddleston, Jonathan Majors, Owen Wilson, and all the other actors and actresses, they did a phenomenal job with their characters. After this show, Loki is probably the best written character and the best developed character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's always been one of my favorite characters long before his show. And to see his story come to such a emotional but also satisfying end is probably the best piece of writing that the MCU has created. Um, since Tony Stark and Captain America, and it really did bring a tear to my eye, and it brought a great conclusion to such a beloved character. And I mean, obviously, round of applause for Tom Hiddleston. I mean, he did a fantastic job portraying Loki after all these 14 years of him, being within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So just to give people a brief rundown of how the first season went of Loki. So basically, obviously, because of the events of Endgame, we see that the version of Loki from 2012, during the first Avengers movie, he's able to gain the Tesseract, and he teleports himself basically out of New York. But because of this, it causes like a disturbance in the timeline. So we see, not shortly after, we see TVA agents basically show up to the desert that he transported himself to, and they take him into custody, and they bring him to something called the TVA, also known as the Time Variance Authority. Basically, it's like this multi-dimensional, multi-timeline um enforcer, or like, police force that basically manages the sacred timeline, make sure that everything is in place, no variants or no like altered histories come about and mess up like, the time itself. And they basically police like, from afar pretty much. And we see that Loki is brought there because he's considered a variant, which is basically a, item or object that altered history and created a new timeline. And because those new timelines are created, the people or items within them are called variants. And obviously, according to the TVA, they were not supposed to exist. So they get pruned or they basically get killed off, and that way it preserves the one linear sacred timeline. So we see the events, throughout the first season that basically Loki kind of goes from being held as a prisoner to actually kind of working with the TVA alongside a character known as Mobius, who is played by Owen Wilson. Eventually, he discovers that there is another variant of himself, but a female variant known as Sylvie, and she is basically trying to break the sacred timeline. Um, in hopes of getting to a character called He Who Remains, which is a Kang the Conqueror or a Kang variant. And he is the sole, I guess, ruler, or watcher of the TVA. He's the one that created it. Um, Sorry. So basically, after, the first season, I mean, like I said, it basically goes through like, Loki finding out exactly what the TVA is and everything. And, towards the end of the show, they basically realize that everybody that, everybody that is working and involved within the TVA is actually a variant themselves. They were taken from, different timelines, and they were, basically they had their memories wiped, and they were forced to work at the TVA. And towards the end of the show, we see Loki and Sylvie eventually confront He Who Remains, which is played by Jonathan Majors, and Sylvie ends up killing him, which results in numerous branches and timelines from the sacred timeline to basically branch out, and we're basically kind of left on like a cliffhanger when it comes to the end of season one. And that basically brings us right into season two. So I mean, obviously, I already said, I gave this season a 10 out of 10. I thought it was phenomenal. All the actors and actresses did really well. Um, but basically, I'm just gonna give you guys like a brief summary, a brief overview of exactly what season two was about. So, I mean, obviously, we start season two with the TVA, and our characters basically trying to pick up the pieces from what just happened. So, I mean, obviously, He Who Remains was killed, and we see that there are numerous branches that are breaking out from the sacred timeline. And if they do not do something about these branches, the object that holds the sacred timeline together, called the temporal loom, is going to explode because it cannot sustain all those new branches, and it is going to collapse. And at that point in time, they think that if the temporal loom explodes and overloads, then that will be the end of existence, basically. So the beginning of the show basically has them trying to figure out ways of, either maybe upgrading the temporal loom to help it, contain all these new branches, or, just simply finding a way to stop, the eventual downfall of the TVA. So we see that obviously there's a little bit of discourse throughout the TVA. We see that there are some, TVA timekeepers and some, personnel within the TVA that want to prune all the new branches, therefore saving the sacred timeline. And there are obviously those like our characters that do not want to do that because they would be murdering millions of people, and they want to preserve all these new timelines. Um, Especially after finding out that they are all variants and they all live lives on different branches at one point. So, we see that there's a little bit of a scuffle, between these characters, in the first, I want to say at least two, three episodes of the show. And, basically, the beginning of the season kind of follows just our characters, so mainly Loki and Mobius. I mean, of course, there's Renslayer, and then, there's Miss Minutes, there's Ouroboros that we're introduced to. Um, but overall, it really focuses more on like Mobius and Loki, to be honest. So we see that they basically go off on a mission, and basically, I believe at the time the mission was to basically find another variant of He Who Remains. Because if you have watched what movie is it? I believe it's Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium. If you stayed for the post credit, you see that Loki and Mobius are at the Chicago World Fair back in the 1800s, and we see that a He Who Remains variant or a Kang variant known as Victor Timely is basically showing a prototype of what is going to be the temporal loom in the future. And basically, with this knowledge, Loki and Mobius try to track down Victor Timely in hoping of him bringing him back to the TVA in order to find a solution to stop the temporal loom from overheating and exploding. At the same time, we have Renslayer and Miss Minutes also trying to find Victor Timely, but for a much different reason. They want to find Victor Timely in order to bring him back to the TVA, but eventually turn him into another He Who Remains or another Kang variant, and basically kind of like quasi rule the TVA with him as the figurehead. Because obviously we find out that He Who Remains created Miss Minutes, and that there was a point in time where He Who Remains and Ravonna Renslayer either had some sort of romantic relationship or just relationship, and we see that she is partly responsible for stopping the multiverse war between all the Kang variants and helping establish the TVA. But we see towards the end of the show that she actually had her mind wiped by Miss Minutes, by the orders of He Who Remains, which is why she does not remember anything until later in the show when she is actually shown that clip of her talking to He Who Remains. So at the time, early in the show, we have these two teams obviously trying to find Victor Timely for two totally different reasons. And then we have a little bit of a wild card. We have Sylvie. Obviously, after the events of season one, she went to one of these newly established timelines, and she actually got a job at McDonald's, of all places, just to try to live some sort of normal life. And when she hears that there is another Kang variant out there, she decides to also go to the Chicago World Fair, but not to bring him back to the TVA or put him in charge, but to actually kill him, because her entire goal in life is to basically just kill all the Kang variants, because obviously she blames him for literally everything that occurred in her life, from when she was taken as a child to where she is now, basically. So we have these three teams, all different purposes, trying to find Victor Timely. Um, and that basically brings us to like, kind of the middle of the show, to be honest, where, all these characters meet up at the Chicago World Fair and we're introduced to Victor Timely. And we see him go through his presentation that we saw in that end credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium. And we see that both Renslayer and Loki and Mobius are vying for his attention. Um, and we see that eventually, like some sort of small fight breaks out, and we see Sylvie arrive to try to kill Victor Timely, but we see Loki defend him. And obviously, after all the air is cleared and the dust settled, we see that Ravonna and Miss Minutes are actually successful enough into helping Victor Timely escape some mob bosses or tycoons, basically. And they board a ship that is going back to his research facility or his lab. But we see that obviously there's a little bit of some double crossing, because we see that Ravonna Renslayer is put on a boat and kind of just dropped in the middle of the water, as Miss Minutes has her own plan when it comes to Victor Timely. So we basically have four different groups of people that are basically all looking for Victor Timely for all totally different reasons. We end up seeing Victor Timely and Miss Minutes arrive at the facility in the warehouse, and she is basically like head over heels, or head over AI in love with Victor Timely, because she was created by He Who Remains, and I guess they probably ruled side by side, or they were in some sort of partnership for probably hundreds of thousands of years. Um, and honestly, at the end of the day, Miss Minutes just longs for a human body, because she has a conversation with Victor and she wonders why she wasn't given a human body, um, as an AI, and she was just kept as, basically the image of a clock. And we see obviously Victor Timely is like extremely freaked out because he has all these different people coming to him, telling him all these different things, and he doesn't know what to believe. So he ends up shutting down Miss Minutes. um, but not too far after, Ravona eventually gets to the facility and basically puts her foot down and is like forcing Victor Timely to do exactly what she says. Then we see Loki and Mobius and Sylvie show up, and then we have some sort of like four-way Mexican standoff, which eventually leads to Sylvie actually helping Loki and Mobius get Victor Timely back to the TVA. And I believe Sylvie basically just kicks um, Ravonna Renslayer into, well, I don't know if she's kicked or if she's pruned. But she's basically sent to that place that we saw in the first season where the pruned variants and characters go, that got eventually eaten by this like giant mystical beast that was captured and put in that realm to basically just dispose of all the garbage or all the variants that have been pruned and sent there. Um, so we don't really see her character until a little bit later in the show, to be honest. But obviously, after Victor Timely gets to the TVA, that's when he's introduced to a couple of other characters. So specifically Ouroboros, because we find out that Ravona and Miss Minutes actually went back in time to when Victor Timely was a child, and they dropped off a handbook of the TVA that was written by Ouroboros. And basically, this helped Victor Timely grow up and pursue the field that he wanted to, and then he took his own notes. So basically, when Victor Timely gets to the TVA and sees Ouroboros, they're both like starstruck from each other, and they both want each other to sign the handbooks and everything. And there's definitely some comedic value that's like spread throughout the show that makes it a little lighthearted and enjoyable. I mean, the character of Victor Timely is just so good, to be honest. Um, so, I mean, eventually we see that he kind of gets settled in, and him along with Casey and Ouroboros try to figure out a way to expand the temporal loom and allow it to basically take hold of all these other timelines, instead of pruning them and killing millions. So, we see a little bit of a montage. I mean, obviously, we see one final attempt by Ravonna and Miss Minutes to get Victor Timely back, but we see, thanks to Loki and Sylvie teaming up, that they are unsuccessful. Miss Minutes is officially shut down for now, and I believe Ravonna is actually pruned by a TVA by a TVA guard that was under mind control by Loki and Sylvie. So we see that these two characters kind of get casted to the side until the very end, obviously, which I'll discuss in a couple of minutes. So now that that party was, pretty much taken care of, we see that they found some sort of way to expand the temporal loom and hoping of, accepting all these new branches. So after they figure out basically what to do, they have to send somebody on that walk, that we saw done earlier in the season, the one that was done by Mobius when he wore that space suit and basically went out onto the bridge. We see that that has to be done again because something has to be connected at the end of the bridge that basically shoots up into the temporal loom, and it's supposed to help expand it and then contain all those new branches. So we see that Victor Timely, volunteers himself. Everything is going great. He gets the suit on. He has, the thing in his hand. The first thing he does, he steps out the door. All of a sudden, he just becomes spaghetti. Basically, the radiation and the energy from, the temporal loom basically just fried him, and everybody is just sitting there in shock and they have no idea what happened, which leads to all of our characters basically just looking on in disbelief as the temporal loom eventually just slowly overloads and explodes, and we see this big white flash, and then that's how that episode ends. So we're kind of left on a cliffhanger until the following episode. And then as we near the end of the show, we basically see Loki wake up, and we see that he is time slipping again, sort of how he was in the beginning of the show. And we see that he is back at the TVA actually, and he has continued the time slip on and off. And eventually, he keeps time slipping to different points on the timeline where his friends or the characters that we know and love are on the timeline. And in these different realities, they have no idea who they were. They have no idea that they were part of the TVA or anything. They are just probably different variants of these characters that we know and love. So Mobius and one of the TVA guards, and Casey and Ouroboros, and so on and so forth. So basically, Loki basically gathers up the gang. He gathers up everybody that was in that room at the time of the temporal loom's explosion, and gathers everybody up in hopes of trying to figure out how to get back to that point in time so they could do things differently. And we see that although he is successful in gathering everybody up, and then he even goes and finds Sylvie and then gathers her up as well, we see that whatever is going on after the destruction of the temporal loom is starting to slowly kill and destroy all these other timelines that were created. So we see a beautifully shot cinema, I'm sorry, a cinematographic scene of Sylvie's timeline, basically fade around her. And we see her in a record shop, and it's basically just slowly closing in on her. And what I love is that towards the end of it, she just simply opens a portal and steps into it. Um, so that was really well done visually. And we see the same thing starting to happen at the facility or the warehouse that Loki and the group are at. And then, at this point, you're thinking that, all is lost, there's nothing that we could do. But all of a sudden, Loki realizes the, newfound power that he has and what he could do, and basically finds out that he can control the time slipping, he can control time itself. And we see him basically go on this journey, and he basically goes back to the point in time right before Victor Timely goes out on the gangway and gets evaporated. And he tries a couple of times, to speed up the process, but unfortunately fails. And then he realizes that he needs to have the same level of knowledge, when it comes to physics and technology as Ouroboros and Victor Timely, and that literally takes centuries. So Loki is literally going back in time for centuries, learning all this knowledge on physics and probably quantum physics, technology, whatever you name it. So he spends centuries doing this, and to us, it's only a matter of minutes. But for him, in that moment, everybody else, it's also a couple of minutes too, probably. But for him specifically, it's been centuries that he's been at this, which is just unfathomable, to be honest, to just kind of think about that for a second. um so we see that he goes through all this work, he spent centuries doing this, and this and that, and then he finally thinks that he did it. Victor Timely goes out there, he shoots the thing into the temporal loom, he makes it back. We see that the temporal loom expands, it stabilizes all these new timelines, and everything looks like it's going to be okay. And then all of a sudden it just starts to overload again. And then that is where, we see Loki and our characters at our lowest, because he just spent centuries trying to save this timeline, trying to save his friends, and nothing is working. And then he finds out from Victor Timely that the temporal loom is never going to hold any of these new branches, because there is always going to be an infinite number of branches that is created. So when he finds out that whatever he's doing in that moment is basically useless, then he goes back further in time to before, when Sylvie killed He Who Remains. And he tries to stop her multiple times in hopes of just keeping everything the way it is, therefore saving the timeline and saving his friends. But then he soon finds out that one of Sylvie's main purposes in the show and just in life is to kill He Who Remains. No matter how many times he tries, she ultimately just does the same thing over and over and over again. And he's basically caught in that same loop that he was when they were trying to fix the temporal loom. So because of this, eventually He Who Remains speaks up, which I thought was one of the coolest parts of the show. And he's like, "So how long have you been at this for?" And He Who Remains basically knows everything. He knows who Victor Timely is. He knows why Loki is doing this. He knows how many times he's done this. And He Who Remains and Loki have such a very important conversation that, for those of you that maybe not understand the show or a little confused on what happened, should really go back and watch that, because it is a great piece of dialogue between Tom Hiddleston and Jonathan Majors, and it really explains the whole reason why Loki is doing this and what the whole point of the season actually is. And basically, He Who Remains says that, yeah, the temporal loom is just a failsafe. Basically, if it gets overloaded or if it gets destroyed, its sole goal is to save the sacred timeline. So that's basically kind of like a failsafe in case anything goes wrong. So then Loki realizes that, okay, well, I don't even need to do anything with the temporal loom now because that's not the issue. So basically, in that conversation, I mean, not only does he realize his purpose and what he needs to do, but he also realizes how to control time even further. Because obviously, we see like Victor, he who remains like stop time, and then like make Sylvie disappear, and then Loki does the same exact thing. So then you see that this is not the first conversation that Loki and He Who Remains has had. So the whole like last episode is just like it's just so good because like you just realize that like everything has already been planned out, everything's already been decided. I mean, it is just such a good conclusion to the show. I mean, it is just, oh, it's just such good writing on the side of the writers and the director and everything. It's just so good. Um, so we see Loki finally return to that point in time where they were originally going to send Victor out there to obviously try to stabilize the temporal loom, but then he realizes that what he has to do is that he has to go out there himself. And that's where we keep getting these lines and these memes about burdened with glorious purpose. And that is basically just referring to he knows what he has to do. And the only way to save his friends and to save the timeline is if he goes out there and he takes over it himself. So in this beautifully shot scene, we see Loki step out onto the gangway and we see him get hit with the radiation, but we see this really smooth transition of him going from his TVA clothes to this really nice green robe, and we see like his long horns like form and then go like to the back. We see this beautifully shot scene, and we see with his newfound powers and his magical powers that he has as a god already, that he is able to basically take control of the timelines. And we see that even though the timelines implode, he grabs all the timelines and he basically goes into this part of the universe or just a part out of time, and he finds a broken down throne, kind of like of what look kind of what He Who Remains I guess layer or sanctuary looked like, but we see something along the lines of that. So we see him grab all these timelines and drag them slowly to this throne. And then once he sits down, then he basically lets go of this like massive amount of energy that basically just turns all the timelines green. And he basically becomes the sole protector and watcher of all the timelines within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then Loki himself basically becomes the man at the end of time. And then we see, after these events, we see that the TVA still exists, but their sole purpose is to more or less track all the Kang variants and make sure that they know that the TVA doesn't exist. And I'm sure if they do, then they were probably going to send people after these Kang variants to, either prune them or dispose of them. But we see some characters like Mobius and Sylvie go back to their own timelines of their choosing and live a life that they thought they never were going to live. And then obviously we see Miss Minutes is put back online by Ouroboros and Casey as she's been like reprogrammed and rebuilt basically. Um, and then we see Ravonna Renslayer finally wake up in that realm, where all the pruned variants go. And we see that she is staring down, the mythical beast face to face. And we don't know her fate. We don't know if she dies or what happens. I mean, there hasn't been any announcements of Loki season 3 yet. So we don't know what's going to happen to these characters. And then unfortunately, there were no post credits or anything, so there was nothing to like tease or kind of look forward to for the future. So that's basically how the show ends. I mean, obviously, this is a very narrow and broad summary of the season, and what we basically saw and went through and whatever. But that's basically the official rundown, to be honest. So hopefully that made sense for everybody. I mean, just to kind of give a brief summary on that summary. Um, so we see that Loki and his team are basically trying to figure out and stop the events of the end of season 1 from happening. So we see that their goal is to fix the temporal loom in hopes of securing all these new timelines that were formed. So we see in order for them to do that, they need the help of a Kang variant. So they find a man named Victor Timely. Obviously, there are a bunch of different parties that are interested in this man that I explained earlier in the episode. Um, but ultimately, we see that Loki and his team are able to get him back to the TVA, and he helps Ouroboros and Casey figure out a way to expand the temporal loom. Unfortunately, that fails because he is obviously, disintegrated as soon as he steps out on the gangway. Then we see the temporal loom explode, and then we see Loki try to pick up the pieces, control his time slipping, gather all his friends up again. And then we see that even though he does that, ultimately it fails again, which makes him realize that he needs to use his new found time powers to basically, figure this out for himself. And then obviously, after centuries of trial and error and figuring out what works and does not work, he finally figures out what he needs to do, and ultimately he needs to sacrifice himself in order to save the timelines and to save his friends. And he becomes, the king at the end of time, and he is the one that is going to be responsible for all the timelines in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And we see that the TVA is still up and running and operational, and they are more on a mission now to like look for other Kang variants and make sure that they don't know that TVA exists. And then we see some of these other characters like Sylvie and Mobius basically go out onto the sacred, timelines themselves and find a life for themselves and kind of move on from, everything that they've been through. And then that's basically how the show ends. So I mean, like I said, it really was a fantastic show. There are some people that like have given it such poor ratings, and honestly, I have no idea why. Like those people just either must be drunk or they just literally do not understand a single thing that they are watching because it's really not that hard to understand. Um, but overall, obviously, it's been very highly successful and praised by the community, which is great to see because obviously this is just another boon to Phase 5 that was very much needed. And like I said, it kind of puts Phase 5 in that place where, you know what, they gave us a pretty satisfactory year, for the start of their phase. And yeah, I mean, like I said, this was a really great show. Hopefully I explained it, good enough. And I got my thoughts and opinions out in the open. But yeah, it was a fantastic show. I mean, like I said, the character development for Loki was top notch and probably the best out of the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. All the other supporting cast, like Jonathan Majors, Owen Wilson, Ouroboros, all the other characters, they were phenomenal. Um, I think the story and the plot line, I think, although it might be a little confusing at some points, I think overall it was a great story. And it really just impacts and really goes into more depth into Loki's character because of this plot. And I mean, I just absolutely loved it. The visuals were fantastic, especially with the whole time slipping and like, the pruning of the timelines, and especially that one final scene in the finale where he's walking across the gangway. I mean, absolutely phenomenal. Like I said, overall just 10 out of 10 show. I mean, it was phenomenally written, and it was a great conclusion to Loki if this is the last time that we see him after his 14 years on the screen. But that is pretty much going to do it for me, guys. Thank you for coming along and taking part in my discussion. Where I went over Loki season two. Like I said, fingers crossed that we'll be back next week with some more content. Looks like we're going to be shifting gears a little bit and doing a little bit more on the Marvel front. As the end of the year seems to focus a little bit more on Marvel. So we'll probably have a maybe casual, laid back episode. Where we just talk about some news or anything that Joey wants to talk about, or I want to talk about personally. So just keep your notifications on, and we'll keep you updated when we're going to be getting to get together and provide an episode for you guys. But unfortunately, since it is Thanksgiving and Black Friday weekend next week, if we can't get together, that is pretty much the reason why. So hopefully you guys have enough content available on YouTube and then also on your podcasting platforms to basically last you guys for a week without Two Sons podcast. Either that or we're just going to record an episode earlier in the week. So just maybe expect an earlier episode next week, or just one, not at all. I mean, like I said, my brother will make sure to post his social media and let you guys know what is going on, and when we figure out the best course of action, obviously. But yeah, I mean, thank you guys for coming out and enjoying another episode of Two Sons Podcast. We really appreciate all the love and support, not just in general, but especially on these like little solo episodes. They seem to do pretty well. So just again, thank you guys for coming out and just um just really just exploring, a little bit of Marvel with me and a little bit of Loki. So like I said, if you guys enjoyed, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, on Two Sons Podcast. So it's with an O, not a U, because we are two brothers. You could also find us on Instagram and TikTok. Also on YouTube at Two Sons Podcast. On Instagram and TikTok, it's going to be Two Sons YouTube. And then on YouTube, it's going to be Two Sons Podcast. So, support us on any of our social medias or channels if you so please. Obviously, for those of you that do not know, we are on Spotify, Two Sons Podcast, and we are also on other podcasting platforms if you do not listen to us through Spotify. So, please, leave a rating, leave us a like, take a part in those polls and little Q&As that we have after each episode. We would love to hear from you guys, love to hear some feedback, especially some ideas for episodes. It would be really cool for you guys to give us a couple ideas every now and then so we could, shout out you guys and, just thank you for all the love and support that you guys give us, throughout the years. But like I said, I am probably honestly going to post this to release later today. So, I mean, it's about, 2 o'clock now on a Friday. So I am probably going to set this to release, maybe around like 6 or 7 o'clock Friday night. So it will be available on YouTube by the end of the night. I will post reminders on these social medias for you guys to check it out, and you guys are aware. However, it probably won't reach Spotify until sometime this weekend, and if not this weekend, then probably Monday or Tuesday, depending on how much my brother has going on and whenever he gets a chance to sit down and post it. But like I said, thank you guys so much for coming out today. It really means a lot. Hopefully, you enjoyed our discussion about Loki season two. And like I said, just be on the lookout for more episodes, more content coming up. And yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoy this episode today. I hope that you guys have a great day, wherever you are, you're staying safe, that you are getting ready for Thanksgiving to spend time with some family and friends and just be thankful for what you have in life and, just ready to do some maybe vigorous Black Friday shopping right after. But with that being said, like I said, thank you guys for coming out today. It really means a lot, and I will see you all in the next episode. Goodbye for now.